Kia ora. What is news, and why does it matter so much to a functioning democracy? Does government funding of journalism mean it can't be trusted? And why are stories written by one news outlet turning up on the websites of other news outlets? I'm Greg Treadwell. I teach journalism at AUT School of Communication Studies, and I'm here today to answer everyday questions about journalism, why it matters so much in a functioning democracy, whether information in your local Facebook group really counts as news, and much more. This is Journalism Matters. Why does journalism matter? And how do journalists hold the powerful to account? Well, sometimes people do end up in court because of the stories that we write or produce. But mostly journalists hold the powerful to account just by letting the public know what they're doing and how they're using the power that we've given them as a democratic public. It's not necessarily dramatic. It's usually just day-to-day journalism that shines a light on what's happening in society. Why do we hear so much criticism now of the mainstream media? What does that mean? Well, to generalize, the media was once often criticized by the left wing for being much too much in the pocket of the system. Now it's more criticized by the right for being too progressive. And that's criticism right up to members of our own cabinet. I think the mainstream media is better called the legacy media. And we need to ask ourselves, has it really changed that much? Or do today's attacks on the media really reflect changes in the political landscape? The term mainstream media has become weaponized since the COVID pandemic. The mainstream or legacy news media, in fact, remains the place, I think, where we can have a more productive conversation about our differences than in highly partisan websites on the internet. The mainstream media can face criticism for being short of progressive ideas and following mainstream thinking. It was once, as I say, strongly criticized by the left for not thinking enough outside the mainstream square about culture and race. I think there's still arguably much work to do in the media in those issues, but I do think it's much better than it used to be. Yes, the mainstream media is vulnerable to critique, but let's be very careful of what we wish for. No legacy media at all would be a free-for-all, Wild West kind of situation. The political edges might make us face new ideas, but it's the mainstream that anchors us and keeps us safe as a community. This is a question that we hear a lot these days. Does government funding of media mean public broadcasters are in the government's pocket? Absolutely not. A country like New Zealand needs a healthy mix of publicly owned and privately owned media. It's highly appropriate in a democracy like Aotearoa for the public to fund news and ensure there's a cornerstone fourth estate, not leaving everything up to market situations. In New Zealand, of course, that's really Radio New Zealand these days. It doesn't mean that they're writing what the government wants them to write. That's the worst thing you can accuse a journalist of. In fact, every journalist I know would find that highly confronting. In fact, there's a very healthy suspicion between state media and the state in a democracy. Why do so many stories seem to be shared on lots of different news websites these days? That story sharing arrangement that's developed across multiple outlets over time does see Radio New Zealand sharing its stories with staff and staff sharing its stories with others. The aim was to spread news far and wide and in some way to be a unified media in a way, but it's somewhat backfired, I acknowledge that. There's been some negative fallout to that because some people now think all media is in cahoots with each other and therefore nobody's truly independent anymore. They're all the same now. In fact, difference in competition is highly valuable in news media, and we shouldn't get sidetracked by the similarities, but focus on this very healthy competition for stories. In fact, that difference in competition is very highly valuable in news media, and in fact is what makes journalists do their best work when they're desperate to get the story first. Here's another question that we hear a lot these days. My local community Facebook group has the news faster than the media. Why is that? Well, let's be very careful about what we call news. There will be information that hits social media before journalists have got it, and that's very much part of the day-to-day process of news now. Stories do tend to break first on social media, but they're not really news until a journalist has got hold of them. When we're talking about democratic news in journalism, it's information that's been verified, that's true, and is relevant. News breaks on Facebook, sure, but it's not journalism until it's been verified. So let's be careful about information on Facebook. A journalist needs to confirm that information matters to the public before we can call it news. Of course, things are called news when they aren't news all the time. So if you're wondering, just ask yourself, has this been verified by a professional journalist whose job is to check its accuracy and relevance? I was asked what my favorite news story of all time is. That's a really interesting question and quite hard to answer. But I think I can't go past the Watergate story from the 1970s. It changed the relationship between journalism and the powerful, and it showed the public how much journalism matters and just what good it can do. If you want to know more about the Watergate story, which was one of the things that brought down President Richard Nixon in the 1970s, I highly recommend a movie called All the President's Men. There are countless fantastic news stories, but I'd just like to tell you about one that I did a while back, where while Bill Clinton was in Auckland in 2000, making a lot of noise about building bridges across the world. We can see today how well that worked. They cleared out the homeless from downtown Auckland and the Auckland domain to make sure the president, didn't rub up against some of the more shameful parts of our society, perhaps. Many of those homeless people ended up on Waiheke for a few days, an island off Auckland where I live. And those homeless people having slept on a cold August night on the beach ended up on Sunday morning in our local Catholic church, eating kai with our parishioners who were celebrating a 60th wedding anniversary. And at first there was a bit of a standoff between these people as the homeless walked in to the church, eyeing, I guess, a cup of tea and a sandwich. And there was a sort of standoff until an elderly parishioner said, "Would you like something to eat?" And then we really built bridges, and these people became part of the family of that church for that day. And I had a marvelous time interviewing those elderly parishioners and some of the representatives of the homeless community for a story about what it means to actually build bridges. And I think the irony of Bill Clinton being in Auckland trying to do the same strengthened the story considerably. So I tell that story because I think the best journalism isn't always about the biggest headlines, but the stories that open the eyes of your readers. Does it matter if we trust the media? It's another question that's very common, and one of the things we research here at AUT these days. Why do so many people say they don't trust the media anymore? First of all, let's just talk a little bit about trust in the media. If we had a population that trusted the media 100% of the time, that would be really problematic. That would mean that we did not have a critical thinking public, because the media needs to respond to what the public tells it as well, and act on behalf of the public. So if we had a non-critical public, that would be, a totalitarian society where people weren't thinking for themselves. So what matters isn't so much the number of people who say they trust the media as whether that's going up or down or being steady. And it is true that in New Zealand in the last number of years, the trust in news has been falling rapidly. I'm pleased to say that it appears to have bottomed out, and we're seeing the beginnings in our research of the stabilization of trust in news. There's a lot of reasons for that too, but one worth mentioning is the distance between now and the COVID pandemic, which upsets so many social relations, including social relations with the news media. Why should you pay for an online news subscription? News seems to be everywhere and mostly for free. Well, the answer to that is because journalists deserve to be paid for what they do. And in the current market, news organizations simply can't afford to pay enough journalists so that we really have adequate democratic journalism. If you pay enough journalists and you pay them well enough, you get quality and in-depth analysis as well as daily reporting. News media have been in a traumatic financial crisis since the 1990s. And if you think that journalism just isn't good enough these days, it may well be that there just isn't enough money to pay journalists. So every subscription that the public takes out starts to rebuild the financial stability of the news media. Another common question about journalism, of course, is the relationship between the journalism that a news organization provides and the advertisers who pay to have their message in the newspaper. Is journalism sustainable in a world where giant companies control nearly all the advertising? And I guess we're thinking major corporations, but also platforms like Facebook and Google. This is one of the risks of journalism relying on advertising, as it has for more than a century now, that stories painful to advertisers might not get run. While every newsroom I've ever been in, there's actually a very strong resistance from the journalists who work there to the idea that stories might be shaped by the needs of advertisers. Journalists depend on integrity as part of their brand, and they don't have success until their brand is successful. Untrustworthy journalism is called out pretty quickly, and it doesn't last. People aren't stupid. What are journalistic ethics? It's a good question. They're the rules by which journalists operate to ensure that as little harm as possible is done when they're reporting on the world. That doesn't mean that harm never happens. Journalism is a complex thing, and sometimes the stories we run, people really don't want to see those stories run, but the public deserves to hear those stories. But it does mean that journalists are obliged ethically to choose the path of least harm. And there are codes of ethics for the legacy media that you can hold it to account through if it does behave unethically. So there are agreed rules by which journalists operate, and if the public believes they're not operating, the Broadcasting Standards Authority and the New Zealand Media Council are places you can go to see if these journalists really have behaved ethically. I'm often asked what advice I would give somebody wanting to be a journalist. And my answer is pretty simple. Devour the news. Be incredibly curious about what's going on in your life, in your whānau, in your community, in your country, and in the wider world. Care about the world and the people in it. Beyond that, get your apostrophes right. And here's one that is perplexing all sorts of places in society at the moment. What role, if any, should AI have in reporting the news? Well, to be honest, my instinct is just to shut the whole thing down. But I'm not going to be able to do that. And I think it's unrealistic to expect AI not to make an appearance in your news, and indeed it already is. It's already being used for researching stories, for organizing homepages. The question is that how transparent must we be when we use AI in news? We must not leave the public in any doubt that a human has written the news they're reading or viewing today, even if AI has been incredibly helpful in gathering the news and producing it. People often wonder, what is clickbait? And how is it different from regular news? How do you recognize clickbait? It's a very interesting question. Some news is clickbait. Clickbait refers to the nature of the story when it's just absolutely irresistible and you find yourself clicking on it before you've really decided to. But that could be when it's a very high human interest story, like the incredible feats of a mountain rescue dog. That's irresistible clickbait and will bring in newsroom readers. But it's also news. Rescue dogs matter to our communities. The 150th cat video you've seen, that's just clickbait. The question we need to ask ourselves is to what extent that's displacing or limiting more valuable news. We've always had a variety of news in our newspapers. Human interest stories are part of the daily tapestry of life, but we've just got to make sure that we're not publishing stuff that has no public interest in it, because then that simply is clickbait. I guess this is the question that we're all asking. What is the future for journalism in these crazy digital days? I'm not sure, but I know it's tied up with the future of our democracy. If we allow journalism to become any further degraded, it's our democracy that we're allowing to be damaged. Thanks for watching Journalism Matters. I hope you've got a renewed interest for the important role that journalists play in your democracy.